Thank you so much for joining us this evening, Elif Shafak.
Thank you.
So, when I was a journalist based in Jerusalem, I remember having a conversation with a friend of mine who's an American journalist from New York. And we both said that while we were incredibly grateful and lucky to have been based in that region for a while and learned so much from that experience, it was going to be quite nice to go back to cities where, you know, nationalism was not the obsession, and things like race and religion and ethnicity were not so horribly politicized. And, you know, a few years later, she woke up in Trump land just after I woke up in Brexit land. All of which is to say that we in the UK arrived quite late to this latest iteration of ethno-nationalist populism, but we are here, we're at the party, yay. So you have said that Turkey is an important case study in all of this because so much of what is happening there holds important lessons for people everywhere else who care about the future of democracy. And I wondered if you could tell us a little bit about that.
Oh, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. And I'm also very much looking forward to your questions, your comments afterwards. I think what stays with me is, if I may take you a little bit back in time,
please.
Not that long ago, but maybe a decade ago or almost 2 decades, you will remember there was a time of so much optimism, extreme optimism. Of course, this happened in the aftermath of the collapse of the Berlin Wall. The wall had come down, the Soviet Union was no more. And we have read early 2000s article after article in media and academia predicting how fascism had lost, socialism had lost, and liberal democracy had triumphed. And from now on, history could only move in one direction, a linear progress. And there was so much optimism that people thought even those countries that were lagging behind would feel compelled to catch up somehow. And I think at the time, what struck me was most of that optimism was applied to the region, to the Middle East. So you will remember when the uprisings happened in Iran, it was regarded as a Twitter revolution. We have read New York Times columnists saying from now on the youth in the Middle East would be firing tweets to topple down authoritarian leaders. When the Arab Spring started, it was also regarded as a time of, you know, how Facebook was going to bring democracy. Yeah. And you will remember there's a young couple, there was so much optimism that a young couple named their newborn daughter Facebook. So as we're speaking right now, there's a young girl, almost teenager now, whose name is Facebook. And her very existence symbolizes the optimism of a bygone era. And of course, the biggest optimists were the tech optimists back then. But fast forward, I think today, the pendulum has swung to the other end. And it's almost, we have, all of us plunged into a time of pessimism. I think in many ways, this is the age of anxiety, almost an existential angst. A lot of anger, fear, resentment, bitterness. And it's an age in which negative emotions guide and misguide politics and are generated by politics in return, almost like a vicious circle. Turkey in this story holds a very important place. In 2017, Freedom House published their report, and it was quite interesting. They showed that 35 countries had made progress, which looks like great news. But the second line of the report says twice as many countries, 71 in total, had been sliding backwards with a bewildering speed. And there's no doubt that Turkey is one of those 71 countries. And the case of Turkey shows us that, of course, history doesn't always move forward. It does go backwards sometimes. But I think it also shows us that democracy is not the same thing as majoritarianism. You might have a ballot box. You might have relatively regular elections. That doesn't make a system a democracy. If you don't have rule of law, if you don't have separation of powers, a free, diverse media, independent academia, women's rights, minority rights, if you don't have any of those and just end up with a ballot box, that system is majoritarianism. And from majoritarianism into authoritarianism, it's a very short slide. And that's exactly what happened in Turkey. First, gradually, and then with a bewildering speed. I think the decline into authoritarianism has been very, very fast.
So, I mean, that does seem like a sort of a foretaste of what then happened in the UK and in the US. And people have said that, you know, Turkish President Erdogan wrote the populist playbook.
Yeah.
I've also heard it said, by the way, that Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu wrote the populist playbook. I'm wondering what your take is on that. Did they kind of provide a manual for authoritarians to come?
I think one thing is very clear. Just like extremists embolden extremists elsewhere, you know, they feed each other. Dictators and autocrats are also emboldened by each other's presence. You know, in a world where you can get away with anything, you know, when journalists can be killed, murdered in the most horrific ways, and people get away with it, what kind of a message that gives to autocrats all around the world? That is the world we're living in right now. For me, it is very crucial to be very vocal in our criticism of autocracy, of the lack of democracy in countries such as Turkey, and now we see similar patterns in Hungary, in Poland, but then Brazil, the Philippines, Venezuela. So the list is very long. But at the same time, make a distinction between that and the people. Because the tragedy of lands such as ours is oftentimes the people are ahead of their governments, but they lack the power to change those governments or to change politics. So to me, it's very important not to think that the government and the people are one and the same thing, and to take a closer look at the civil society, to see the layers. Countries like Israel, countries like Turkey, they have very robust, but maybe robust is not the right word anymore, but more complex civil societies than it's recognized from outside. And for me, it's equally important to say, you know, there are progressives in these countries, there are Democrats in these countries. Don't forget their existence, that they do exist.
Yeah, I want to ask you a little bit. We're looking, you know, tonight's debate is who is we the people?
Yeah.
And I want to look a little bit at this idea of elites. Erdogan talks a lot about elites. He declared the tyranny of elites is over when AKP won a majority in 2011. You know, leading Brexit campaigners talk about elites, so does Trump. When Theresa May gave her her horrible Citizens of Nowhere speech in October 2016, she said, quote, "Too many people in positions of power behave as though they have more in common with international elites than with the people down the road, the people they employ, the people they pass on the street." I just wanted to read that out again as a reminder of, you know, what was said by our Prime Minister. What is being signalled there with the invocation of elites?
So I think populism is an ideology, but it's a very weak ideology. It's like a bird with one wing. And in order to fly, it needs something else. And oftentimes that something else is nationalism, you know, populist nationalism. And of course, there's a variety of populist nationalisms across the world, and there are differences as well, but there are incredible similarities too. And one of the core things about populist nationalism is this dualistic way of thinking, binary oppositions, the people versus the elite. That is the cliche that they keep repeating over and over. But I think we need to be very careful about what exactly they mean by the people, what exactly they mean by the elite. You know, we need to dissect that a little bit. Actually, there's a story that I like a lot when we go all the way back to the French Revolution, the Jacobins, of course, you know, people who came to power in the name of people, then started slaughtering people in the name of people, you know, people who called themselves the people. It's a story that goes all the way back in centuries. But one of the interesting things that happened around the same time was the populists of the time wanted to build a statue on Pont Neuf, and a statue of the people. That was their aim, right? And they started to quarrel among themselves, because how do you visualize the people? Is it a woman? Is it a man? Is it a peasant? Is it a worker? Is it young, old, short, tall? Simple questions, but it just shows us the complexity of who exactly is the people. It's not a monolithic whole. And in the end, they keep quarreling so much they can't build the statue. So fast forward, today, for me, this is a myth that populists claim to speak in the name of the people is an illusion, is a myth they're trying to create. In fact, if you scratch the surface, underneath there's a duality. And we hear this in their speeches. Just to give you a few examples, you will remember Trump during his election campaign, in one of his speeches he said, to me it was very interesting, he said, the important thing for us is to unite the people. And then the second line was, as for the other people, they don't mean a thing. So who are the other people, you know? And that other can change. It can be today, it can be liberals. Tomorrow it can be minorities, Muslims, Jews, LGBT communities. You know, it's endless, but there will be an other for them. Nigel Farage, after the Brexit vote, you will remember the first statement, one of his earliest statements was, the real people, the decent people in this country have spoken. Who are the unreal people? You know, if you say decent people, what is the opposite of that? So whom are you excluding? Always it has to exclude someone. Erdogan, he claims, he makes it very clear, actually in a quite aggressive way. He says, you know, I represent the 50 and there's the other 50. They don't matter, you know, and he oftentimes says, you know, I'm just holding my 50 at home, but I might not do that. So there's also that kind of threat underneath, which I find very alarming. So there's an illusion of a monolithic people, but underneath they always divide the people. Now we also need to look at the elite. Are we convinced that populist demagogues represent the people and they themselves are not the elite? They are also elite. When you look at people like Marine Le Pen, Geert Wilders, and many leaders of the populist movements today, they come from financial elite, they come from political elite, they are just as elite as the people they, you know, claim to criticize. The Italian sociologist Pareto, he wrote about this a century ago, you know, about this pendulum of elites, circulation of elites. He used to call them foxes versus lions. But what he was warning us about was, you know, an elite group is being replaced by a new elite, but they are just as elitist as the previous one. So in a nutshell, what I'm trying to say is populists, despite their claim to represent the people, they have no problem with elitism so long as they are the elite.
So long as they're the ones who are in control.
So long as they are the ones who have the power,
rhetoric.
and we shouldn't be therefore deceived by the argument that they represent the people, that they're on the side of the people. It's a myth they're creating.
I'm interested in, following on from that, what you think about the left-wing use of elite, because the populist or the radical left will also invoke elites. Jeremy Corbyn of the Labour Party will talk about elites, and is there a way in which you can use that to reference, you know, the control of a few, you know, a financial and political class that is holding control and power and finances at the expense of the majority? Is there a formulation that is 99% without ending up with the 1% being the elite in that kind of shadowy, negative way? Is there a responsible use of the word?
I think there is a responsible way of discussing this, and we must, because this is the year 2019, and finally inequality is at the center of our debates, and it must be. And I agree with Bernie Sanders when he says, you know, this is not only a political issue or a financial economic issue, it's a moral issue, and we need to address it. It is unacceptable, and this has been the case for so long. When you look at the figures since 1980s, mid-1980s, the median household income has been stagnant, while the 1%'s profits and wealth has been doubling, in some countries even more, and the gap is just widening and widening. If so much power and wealth and profit is concentrated in the hands of only a few people, how can this be a just system? So we need to talk about inequality. But my only warning is the way the term elite is used today is quite sinister, in the sense that it's being associated with liberal democracy and with liberals. So when you listen to populist demagogues, what they're saying is, it doesn't matter whether you're part of the 1%. It doesn't matter whether you are, benefiting from that inequality. That doesn't make you an elite. But if you have liberal democratic principles or values, then you are the elite. So you might happen to be a student who can't even pay her tuition, fee. You might happen to be a teacher who can't afford a house in central London. But if you happen to have liberal values, you're the elite. That is the illusion that we need to be careful and cautious about. That's why I want to dissect this term and the way they use the term elite or liberal. Orban does this a lot. For instance, he calls it liberal blah, blah, blah. Yeah. We talk about women's rights and rule of law and freedom of speech, and he says that's liberal blah, blah, blah. So that's the thing we need to be cautious about. But with regards to inequality, I fully agree with you, and it must be at the center of all our debates, I think.
So when we look, I mean, that's a really interesting and an important distinction, and one to challenge, I think. And when we look at the sort of anti-capitalist protests that came in the late 1990s, and they came from the global south, but they ended up, challenging a sort of neoliberal order that had created rampant inequality both between North and South and inside countries themselves. And that ended up being characterized in journalistic terms as anti-globalization, which a lot of the anti-capitalist movement at that time took issue with, because they weren't against globalization, they were just against a sort of inequality that was driven by capitalism. And I wonder, is that the mistake of the left, or the failure in a way that we have allowed essentially neoliberalism to be bound up with liberal values like being pro-migration, pro-women's rights, pro-LGBT rights, pro an open and inclusive and diverse society? Is that the fault line that the left has fallen into in some way?
I think in some ways it is, because what's happening is there's a basket and everything is being lumped together inside the term liberal, but also libertarian, for instance, is something else altogether. But neoliberalism, we need to take a very close look at it, how it works, how it's spread, not only to the market, but to everything, including the way we do politics today. And there are interesting political scientists who have been saying neoliberalism has been damaging liberal democracy so badly. People like Noam Chomsky, they have been saying, there's nothing new or liberal about neoliberalism. So we need to make those distinctions, those nuances. When I look at a place like Silicon Valley, they claim to be, well, they don't say liberal openly, but it seems like they have liberal values right from outside. But again, when you scratch the surface, for instance, they say we're pro-diversity. They say we want an egalitarian world where everyone has an equal voice. Okay. When we look at the figures into the Silicon Valley itself, only 2% of the people working there are Latinas, for instance, 3% African Americans, 15% women. I mean, there's no diversity inside Silicon Valley itself. How are you going to convince me that you are pro-diversity when you don't even employ people who come from minority backgrounds? You see what I mean? So we need to be careful, I think, about the basket they're trying to put us into. You can be a liberal democrat and be very critical of neoliberalism, and in my opinion we should be, because of the inequalities it has created, and because of the way it made a certain market principle applicable to every area of our lives, from education to health, from politics to how we conduct daily life, social relations. That is no good, and that has incredibly damaging impact, in addition to the inequalities that it has created.
Definitely, yeah. And, progressive organizations that say they're about diversity but completely lack diversity in their staff are really my favorite kind of organization, where the diversity is in the canteen staff and the security staff.
Yeah, practice what you preach, we tell them.
Moving on slightly from that, but still on this idea that we're exploring of, who is the people when we talk about this populist notion of representing the people, and of course, the oft invoked will of the people, which I'm sure we're all tired of hearing as a phrase. I almost want to set it to music now. But the Bosnian American writer Alexander Hemon, he has said that in the vast repertoire of anti-Semitic slander, cosmopolitanism is one that proves interesting because, quote, it always includes inherent disloyalty to the native national project. And I wonder if what that evokes for you when we talk about, this populist railing against, the liberal elites, the metropolitan elites, the people who are, to use the really annoying juxtaposition of a certain writer, people who are anywheres versus people who are nowheres. What is going on there, do you think?
Yeah. So there's this town city in Turkey called Sinop. Some of you might be familiar. And the philosopher Diogenes, is that how you pronounce his name in English? In Turkish we call him Diogen. He was from there. And as you might know, he's regarded as the father of cosmopolitan philosophy. He saw himself at the time, back then, as a world citizen. Now, to me, it's quite interesting to see almost every year there are nationalist mobs in Turkey surrounding his statue in Sinop, chanting that statue should be brought down because what is the statue of a Greek doing in our town? So that is the mentality of tribalism. People who don't even know their own history. People don't even know that in their land, it's a mixture of cultures and ethnicities and traditions and languages and dialects, especially in a country like Turkey, which is, when we look at our own forefathers, this was a multi-ethnic, multilingual, multi-religious empire. In all our families, of course, there are Greeks and Armenians, and it's all a mixture. Why can't we understand this? But that's what tribalism does to us. This idea that you must have homogeneous, monolithic, frozen identity, which is again an illusion. To me, it's a question that's very important. It's very close to my heart because, in a way, all my adult life in Turkey, I've been accused of being rootless. And when I started writing in English, there was a reaction. At the time, it was quite unusual for a Turkish writer to also write in another language and live in Turkey. And people said, she's abandoning her mother tongue because for them, for the nationalist mentality, it's always either or. Are you there? Are you here? Are you one of us? Are you one of them? They want to draw a clear line. And I'm saying that is against our nature. As human beings, we are fluid, we have multiple belongings. To me, I am an Istanbulite. I carry Istanbul with me, and I love that city so much. But I'm also attached to the Aegean, the Mediterranean, the Middle East. There are so many elements in my soul that I bring from the Middle East. I'm a European by birth, by choice, the values that I share. Over the years, I have become a Londoner, and despite what Theresa May says, I would like to think that I am a world citizen, and hopefully maybe a global soul. Why can't I have multiple belongings? If I can have multiple belongings, someone else can have multiple belongings, there's a better chance that our belongings can overlap and we can find a common ground, as opposed to having mutually exclusive, imaginary, monolithic identities. So I have always been very critical of identity politics, and I know it's a big issue among our circles as well, liberal left, but I don't see it as a progressive thing. I don't see identity politics as the progressive way forward, and I think we need to be very careful about that. So I lived in America for about 5 years, in Boston, and then in Michigan, and then in Tucson, Arizona. And one of the things that stayed with me when I was in Boston was to learn about African American women's movement. It left a big impact on me. And the reason I'm mentioning this to you right now is because when you read those women, like Audre Lorde, and another person from outside that circle, of course, James Baldwin, interestingly, there was almost always an emphasis on multiplicity. I mean, you listen to Audre Lorde, she says, I'm black, I'm a woman, I'm a poet, I'm lesbian, I'm a mother, I'm this, I'm that. I am many more things that you might not see at first glance. I contain multitudes. Because these women, of course, they were women, they knew about sexism. They were black, they knew about racism. They came from LGBT backgrounds, they knew about homophobia. Many of them came from working class backgrounds, they knew about class, etc., etc. So when they speak about power, for them it's not just one single thread.
Yeah.
When they speak about identity, it's not a single tribe. I think we lost that. Even in the feminist movement today, we lost that kind of emphasis on multiplicity. I don't want to be, drawn into a tribe and to think that's a progressive thing. I want to go beyond tribes. I'm interested in that kind of language that transcends tribes.
What do you think it is about this latest iteration of nationalism that obviously echoes previous ones? What is it that is so upsetting about that kind of complexity, or being hybrid or multiple or hyphenated? What is it that's so? What is it that is to rail against in that notion of complexity?
I think complexity is a bit scary, isn't it? There's too much to handle. But if we can maybe learn not to see it as a burden, but as a source of richness, we might enjoy it. We might approach it in a different way. Of course, the world we're living in is not making it easier for us because we're bombarded by information all the time. And what worries me is when you are subjected to too much information, after a while, our knowledge starts to diminish. So I think too much information is an obstacle in front of knowledge. I make a distinction between information, knowledge, and wisdom. I think they're completely different things. So our knowledge is diminishing as our information increases and as our misinformation increases, so we need to talk about misinformation as well. And wisdom, on the other hand, is something else altogether. For wisdom, I think we need emotional intelligence. It's not only rational analysis, but also emotions, empathy, stories, connecting with other people, connectivity. So that is part of wisdom. And it really pisses me off to see so many populist demagogues being much better than liberals in terms of connecting with people's emotions. I think they do a much better job when I listen as orators. Their language is woven with emotions. But that is how we connect as human beings. We're all emotional creatures. And I can't understand how people on the left, we have not been able to produce that kind of narrative language today. We used to in the past, in the previous decades, but not at the moment. I think there's a gap there.
Yeah, that is something that's quite evident, that the narrative woven by these kind of nativist nationalists is very positive and very hopeful.
Emotional,
I mean, what's more hopeful and positive than take back control? I mean, that was inspired as a slogan, much as it pains me to say so. And you've spoken as a writer. You've said that your presence on the edge of society, so you're close enough to be attached to society, but distant enough to be critical. You've said that that's the right place to be as a writer, and I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I sincerely believe it's the right place for the writer, but it's a lonely place as well,
Yeah.
Especially in a society like Turkey, which is tribal in many ways, and collectivistic identities rule. But it began with my childhood, because I was born in France, and then my parents' marriage collapsed, and my mother brought me to Turkey. Of course, for her, Turkey was home. For me, it was a new country. And I came to my grandmother's house, neighborhood. This was in Ankara, a very conservative, very patriarchal neighborhood. And if I may share this with you, at the time, my mom was a very young divorcee, and young women in her position were immediately married off to someone else because a young divorcee is regarded as a threat to the conservative order. And it was my grandmother, my Eastern, less educated, superstitious, spiritual grandmother who intervened and said, no, you know what, you should go back to university, because my mom had dropped out of university out of love, falling in love. So she said, my grandma said, you should go back to university, you should have a diploma, you should have choices in life, you should have a career. You can get married whenever you want. And when people said, yeah, but she has a child to take care of, she can't do that, my grandmother said, no, I will raise Elif myself until she's ready. So what happened was, in my early years, I called my grandma Anne, which in Turkish means mother, and my own mother I called abla, which is big sister, even though I knew who was who, you know. So my mom went out, she graduated with flying colors. Around the time I was 10 years old, she became a diplomat, and then she took me and herself out of Turkey. We went to Spain, back to Turkey, Jordan, and so on. But I guess the reason I'm sharing this with you is because from a very early age onwards, I felt on the edge of the society for a variety of reasons. And then every time I would come back from abroad, I had a very Turkish nationalistic education, like many people in my generation. But at the same time, I had the opposite. You know, I would go abroad, I would have a more international education, and then come to Turkey, I would have a very nationalistic education. And somehow that helped me, maybe it gave me a bit of cognitive distance to look at it, to compare. So I think I was emotionally very attached to the people, the land, the culture, the history, but at the same time I didn't take things for granted. Just one final example, when I came back from Spain, I was 15 years old. Of course I hadn't forgotten my Turkish, but I realized while I was away, Turkish had moved on, and people were now making new jokes, slang, you know, new idioms, which I couldn't understand, and that was very interesting to me. So instead of saying, you know, I already know this language, it's my mother tongue, it's in my pocket, I bought an Ottoman Turkish dictionary and I started studying Turkish. You see what I mean? So that cognitive distance helps you sometimes to take a closer look at the culture you're coming from. But fast forward, maybe writing in English also gives me some kind of cognitive distance. To be honest, some of my novels, like The Bastard of Istanbul, had I written them in Turkish, they would have been different books. And maybe I would have been a bit more timid. Maybe writing in English maybe made me a little bit bolder on paper. Even the title of the book, you know, when I say it in Turkish, bastard, it sounds so harsh. But in English, and I'm not the only one, I met so many Turkish women, you know, brought up in a certain way who can never swear in Turkish, but they're swearing so freely in English, I'm just surprised, you know, no guilt feeling, no sense of lightness. We change as we move from one language to another. Sometimes we express our anger better in another language, you know, and I realized over the years, if I'm writing about sorrow, melancholy, longing, it's much easier for me to write it in Turkish. But if there's humor, irony, satire in my work, definitely much easier in English. I mean, we Turks don't do irony. We don't even have a word for that, you know.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, it's irony. We just took it because we don't have it. We have a very good sense of humor and black humor, but we don't do irony, you know.
So you and Americans together in that. I'm sorry, that's probably not fair and not true. Apologies up front. I'm wondering what someone who belongs to so many places and is attached to so many places and has a cultural depth across a range of cultures, as you do, and across a range of languages, as you do. I wonder what you can bring to this moment to maybe sort of shine a light or show us a path out of it from a progressive perspective.
I sincerely believe we need to rethink about the public space. And people like Hannah Arendt, to me, they're incredibly important. I've learned so much from reading her, and I think this is the right time to read her work again. But also many Frankfurt School thinkers, they really left an impact on me. And I'm mentioning this because I think civic space is very important. We need more diversity, inclusiveness, you know, more diverse voices in the public space. Across the Middle East, it really pains me to see the public space is mostly male-dominated. Our cities, when you walk, you know, streets belong to men. Public squares belong to men, especially after certain hours. And while that is happening, women, that's one of the things that I wanted to elaborate in my latest novel, Three Daughters of Eve. In the meantime, women are having amazingly important discussions about vital issues, about faith, belonging, identity, sexuality. But the problem is we're having these discussions in the private space with our friends, when we go to a cafe, when we have dinner, but we don't bring it into the public space. So that won't do. You know, we need to diversify the public space, but also the digital public space. I am very worried about the dark side of digital technologies. I think for a very long time, it's a bit like the moon, isn't it? It has a bright side, but it also has a dark side. And because we have talked about the bright side for so long, we have neglected to see its dark side, and I think we must. Is there a public space in digital world, and how does it work? Who owns it? How is it manipulated? We need to pay attention. So all I'm trying to say is I think we need to become alert citizens. We need to become active citizens, engaged citizens. As writers from troubled lands, wounded democracies, we never had the luxury of being apolitical, you know? You can't say, I'm just going to write my stories and not care about what's happening. You can't do that. Also, I am a feminist, and one of the many wonderful things that I've learned from feminist movements of previous generations was politics. When I talk about power, it's not only about, or when I talk about politics, it's not only about parliament, political parties. Wherever there's power, there's politics, including the private space. So if you define politics in such a broad way, again, you can't be non-political. But I think we've entered an age in which maybe all of us have to become a bit more politicized, a bit more engaged, a bit more active. But please don't get me wrong, I'm not talking about partisan politics. I'm not even talking about party politics, and I'm not interested in that. But just to be vocal about core issues, core democratic issues, such as rule of law, such as media, freedom of speech, women's rights, minority rights, because none of these things can be taken for granted. So I think we need to be more engaged and understand what is at stake and how we can go backwards very fast.
I wanted to ask you, I do want to open up so that everyone else can ask a question, but I wanted to ask you about, we were talking about economic inequalities and inequalities of opportunity that have, in part, fueled the sort of resentment and the anger of the age that we're in. And you have said that it's not just economic gaps and cultural gaps, but it's also emotional gaps.
Yeah.
And I wondered if you could expand on that.
Yeah, I mean, there's an interesting research by a group of German political scientists. They studied 800 elections going all the way back to 1870s. And what they found out was after every financial crisis, the political environment favored the rise of far right. This is a pattern and pattern after pattern. We quickly thought, a major financial crisis happened. And many people rightly think that people who were responsible for the crisis have not even paid a price. Yeah. In the meantime, because of austerity, people who had nothing to do with the financial crisis have been paying the bigger price. So there's that kind of inequality. But we don't sometimes understand the implications of, that, the ripple effects, the repercussions of that in our politics today. That said, I don't think what's going on right now can only be understood by looking at economy. Mm-hmm. We need to talk about emotions. Mm-hmm. We need to talk about economic anxiety. We need to talk about demographic anxiety, racial anxiety. In a nutshell, we need to talk about anxiety. Because oftentimes, again, just to give you a few numbers, when I look at the states in the US, 22 states that are most prone to automation in the next decade, 21 of them voted for Trump. 15 states that are least prone to automation, 15 of them voted for Hillary Clinton. The reason I'm mentioning this is because people who have anxieties about the future, what's going to happen to my job? Maybe I have a job, but what's going to happen to my children? Will they be able to find the same kind of education? All of these anxieties are important. I am an immigrant myself, but I think we need to talk about immigration anxiety too. If we cannot talk about these things openly, bravely, we're pushing people towards the lap of the far right, where they think they're welcome to voice any opinion, and that won't do. So we need to have better discussions about these issues, and we must talk about emotions and anxieties. It pains me to see that in political science, oftentimes emotions are underestimated because we have this data fetishism, we're obsessed with data. Yeah. But there are things that can't be measured and yet they're incredibly important. So we need to talk about culture. I think much of the conflict today is happening in the world of culture, and that's why I think writers need to speak up more.
No, it's really interesting because I think there is a sort of strain of thinking on the left that says, because so much of this is driven by economic anxiety, if there were an economic equality, everything would be fine, and you kind of think that's not how prejudice works. That's not how racism
because
works.
It's not rational.
No.
Exactly.
No, and it's not, wealth is not an indicator of bigotry. So, but anyway, on that cheery note, I would like to open up to you all to ask questions, and I would like to